Hi, today in our lesson we are talking about language and the brain. So, when it comes to numerous kinds of animals, we have various kinds of language capabilities that we can communicate with one another, and that is part of what makes us major social creatures, and human beings are no different, and that the language that we form has a lot to do with the culture and language that we experience as young children. But research indicates that all human beings have the capacity for some form of language, regardless of what kind of language that might be. So even a person who grew up without a language like English being demonstrated for them, they would still create their own language. And something we often forget is something like sign language, which is in fact still a language. And it's a language because it's still going to utilize all of the same parts of the brain. So, in our previous lessons, we have learned about the four major lobes of the cerebral cortex, and that includes the frontal lobe, the parietal lobe, the occipital lobe, and the temporal lobe. For most people, their language is going to reside on the left side of their brain in the left cerebral cortex. So, from the outside, it may appear that the two hemispheres of the cerebral cortex are symmetrical, but they're not. And that one of the reasons why we know they are not is because of language, and that for the majority of people, language skills are going to reside in the left hemisphere. This may be one of the major reasons why so many people are right handed, because it identifies that dominance of one hemisphere, which would for many people be the left hemisphere, which would make sense because language is such a dominating factor in our everyday lives. In fact, when we talk about differences between right handed and left handed people, it appears that people who are left-handed tend to have significantly higher abilities in things like their mathematical abilities, their creativity, and their artistic expression. So things like being able to paint or to create music. You see higher numbers of left-handed people being able to do this. And this may be indicative that this is a person whose right side of the brain is actually dominant. But for approximately 90% of the worldwide population, it's going to be the left. And we think most of that has to do with language being located in the left hemisphere. So, in terms of our parts of the brain that deal with language, the two major areas have been identified by the people who discovered them. And so we have the Broca's area and Wernicke's area. Now, it looks like Wernicke, but it's because this is a German, and so it is Wernicke's area. So Broca's area and Wernicke's area. If we look in the diagram below, you can see that Broca's area is identified right here in blue. Typically, Broca's area is going to be located in the left frontal lobe. And Broca's area is responsible for language expression. So, how is it that human beings express their language? And there's two major ways that we do this. The first is what I'm doing right now, and that's speaking. That right in this very moment, I am expressing my language, and I'm expressing my language through my vocal cords and by creating speech. And so it's my Broca's area that is controlling my speech. But there's one other way that we will express our language, and that's through writing. And so that is also going to be Broca's area. So Broca's area in the left frontal lobe is actually directly connected to my motor cortex. And as we learned, my motor cortex is responsible for all of my voluntary muscle movements. And each part of my body that I can move is going to be represented somewhere on my motor cortex. And if you remember, the face and the hand were right next to each other here in the motor cortex, which is right smack dab next door to Broca's area. And so, one of the reasons why we have a lot of language expression with our face and with our hands, they are more closely connected to our Broca's area that is going to express our language. Pretty cool stuff. But the other area of our brain that we identify for language is our language reception, so the receiving of language, or it's also what we refer to as language comprehension. So notice how it says language expression again, but really Wernicke's area is much more involved with the comprehension piece, with the receiving of language. And Wernicke's area is again typically in the left hemisphere, but this time it's in my temporal lobe. So it's indicated right back here in orange. What have we learned about the temporal lobe? Well, we know the temporal lobe is going to sit here on my temple and it's above my ear. The major thing about my temporal lobe is that it includes my primary auditory cortex. It's where I am going to be able to hear, okay? So being able to decipher sounds. So right now, in this exact moment in time, you are using your temporal lobes to be able to hear the words that I'm saying. But if you can comprehend what I'm saying, if you can understand the language that I'm using, you're actually using Wernicke's area, which is right next door to the auditory cortex. That's why it's in the left temporal lobe. So, if you can understand the words that are coming out of my mouth, you're using Wernicke's area. So Wernicke's area, of course, has to do with listening and comprehending through hearing others. But Wernicke's area is also going to be utilized when I'm reading. So being able to read language is also going to be Wernicke's area. So Broca's area is dealing primarily with my language expression, which is going to be speaking and writing. And Wernicke's area is dealing with my language comprehension, being able to read and being able to listen and understand someone's language. Now, the thing about language is that this is a complicated task in which there's a lot of things that potentially can go wrong. So, for a person who specifically damages an area associated with language, we refer to that kind of damage that's taking place in the brain as an aphasia. And so there are people who can develop what's known as a Broca's aphasia or a Wernicke's aphasia. Either way, we're talking about a person who's damaged their brain, and the damage to their brain has specifically affected their language capabilities. So, Broca's area tends to be, or excuse me, Broca's aphasia tends to be a little bit more common. So, in a Broca's aphasia, you have a person who is attempting to say words, but the words that they're saying are not actually coming out as words. So there's a famous case of a person who was referred to as tono, where every time they would speak, the only sounds that were coming out were tono, 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 tono. And so what's happening is that this person who is attempting to say words can't say words because they have this Broca's aphasia, or that they can't speak any longer because they've damaged the Broca's area. They have Broca's aphasia. So those are kinds of aphasias that can take place, either my Broca's aphasia or Wernicke's aphasia. But even if I don't damage my brain, sometimes my language can really get sort of tongue-tied in my mind. In fact, I have a feeling that many of you very much dread the popcorn reading that sometimes takes place in class. You know what I'm talking about. one of your classes, you're reading some kind of passage, and you get called on to read something out loud. And so you suck it up, you read whatever the passage is out loud. Inevitably, the teacher then looks at you and says something like, "Can you explain what you just read to us?" And you're sitting there with a totally blank face because you have absolutely no idea what it is that you just read out loud. You just read it out loud. And it's also likely that when you were reading out loud, you tripped over some words, you had difficulty pronouncing something, even if it's a word that you very much know. So what's happening? Why is that so difficult, especially for us to read out loud? Well, let's look at the process that takes place in order to read something out loud. So first of all, information has to come into my eyes, okay? Because my eyes have to be able to see something. So that eye is going to transform the information into a neural impulse. It's going to travel to the optic nerve, and the optic nerve is going to take that information to the thalamus. And the thalamus is going to say, "Hey, I'm looking at something. This is visual input." And so the first thing that it does is it's sending that information back here to my primary visual cortex, which is in my occipital lobe. That occipital lobe is then going to send the information to an area of the brain that's known as the angular gyrus. The angular gyrus, as it says right here, it transforms visual representations into an auditory code. So for many of you, when you're sitting and reading a novel or something like that, what you might not realize is when you're reading to yourself, there's like an inside voice that's inside of your head that's reading to you. Do you know what I mean? And sometimes even characters will have their own kind of accents and voices and things like that, but it's all taking place inside of your head. So this auditory code that's happening is happening because of your angular gyrus. It's transforming the words that you're reading into this auditory code. And that goes to the Wernicke's area, which is going to interpret, it's going to comprehend what it is that you're reading. So now when you're reading to yourself, that's the end of the process, right? Like that's the end of the road. You don't have to do anything more with it. You've read it, you understand it, and then you keep on reading. That's why for many of us, we much prefer being able to read silently to ourselves than attempting to read something out loud. Because now, if we're going to read something out loud, we've gone through this whole process, right? In the eye, to the thalamus, to the occipital lobe, angular gyrus, Wernicke's area. But now, if I'm reading something out loud, this information then has to go to the Broca's area, which then dictates to the motor cortex which parts of my mouth need to move. That information gets relayed back to the thalamus. The thalamus then relays that information back out into the muscles of my mouth. And all of this is taking place very, very quickly. And so what happens when we read out loud is that often we completely skip over the angular gyrus and Wernicke's area. There's just not enough time for our brain to fully comprehend what it is that we just read out loud. So instead, when we're reading out loud, it's skipping ahead to Broca's area in the motor cortex for us to get that information out of our mouth. And we tend to trip over our words because our brain is attempting to work much faster than my muscles actually can. And so that's where, like when you have a lot of stuttering and things like that, or repeating a word, that's usually where you see that problem occurring. So the next time you want to be really smart in one of your classes where you're being told to read out loud, you could say, "Sure, I'll read out loud, but just don't ask me what it is that I read for you." Until next time, thank you and have a great day.